We want to take a brief but important look now at another new feature in iOS 15.12t, which, depending on how you deal with your clusters, either a lab environment or production customers, if you upgrade your routers, some of them may work, some of the VoIP dial peers may work, but some of them may certainly have issues, and most certainly any new greenfield deployment or any new VoIP dial peers will have issues. And what we're getting to is something called the toll fraud TCL application that's embedded by default and monitors all VoIP communications between Cisco iOS routers / TDM, or actually really rather VoIP gateways, has nothing to do with TDM, and whomever they happen to be talking to, or people that attempt to talk to them. So, and really this is actually more about people talking to them. So devices trying to contact the VoIP gateway. The VoIP gateway can talk to outbound connections just fine because it's sort of like saying, do you trust yourself? But I don't necessarily trust other people unless I'm told to. So let's just look at an example here. Let's turn on our debugging. Okay, we've got ISDN Q931 on. And let's do debug VoIP dial peer as well. And we'll just clear off our screen and scroll back buffer. And we're going to go ahead and bring up a phone. Let's just bring up this phone here. We happen to be working on our cluster 2 right now. If we haven't mentioned it, we have a second cluster that we'll be using for other various tasks. But let's just go ahead and try to dial 911. And we see that behind this is a configured, well, actually 911 is not a configured pattern. 9.911 is. So let's just copy 911, or copy it to 911. Whoops. Oh, that's right. We actually have it in here as a route pattern, so let's just get rid of that. There was some testing I was doing earlier. Let's go back to translation pattern, 9.911, copy it to 911, and of course we're doing the same things that we were, prefixing a plus to the called number. Of course that gets stripped on the egress, called party transformation pattern CSS on the egress gateway. We're sending it on to the calling search space for translation pattern to PSTN route pattern is what that stands for. Okay, so now we have our 9.911 and 911. We've got other PSTN patterns as well, but this is the one we'll use. So let's go to our phone and dial 911. And hopefully you can hear the reorder tone. We'll go ahead and hang up, and let's take a look. Let's take a look back at our iOS router. And we see that we had, first of all, this is all the scroll back we have. And so you'll probably note here real quick the lack of ISDN Q931 debug output. We see the calling number was the external phone number mask. The called number was 911. We have an incoming dial peer of 105. So let's just take a look at that. Show run pipe 2 section voice 105. So here is our incoming called number, voice class codec, voice class H323, DTMF relay. We even have a translation profile to prefix a 9 to everything but 911. We could do a debug voice translation to see that there is no prefix happening or no translation happening. There would be if we tried to call any number other than 911. And regardless of all that, we not only see the incoming dial peer, but if we scroll to the bottom of our debug VoIP dial peer, we see a result success list of matched outgoing dial peers is dial peer tag 10. So let's look up voice 10. And here we see that it matched destination pattern 911, port 000:23, and forward digits 3. Is this our proper port number? Well, for ISDN, it wouldn't let us attach this port number to the dial peer, iOS wouldn't, if it wasn't a proper port. Let's see if ISDN is up. Show ISDN status. And for 000:23, the D channel, we have multiple frames established. So the ISDN PRI is up. So why wasn't the call going out? Let's undebug all, clear off our screen and scroll back, and debug voice CC API in-out. Inbound and outbound communication. Okay? So let's just clear off our screen and scroll back again with that new debug running and try this call again. Okay, so if we scroll up, we see the call come in, the ANI, and the destination or called number. And here, we see a lot of information, but I'm going to skip down to the relevant bit, which is the fact that the call control process, call setup indicator, CC API, or Call Control Application Programming Interface, handed the call ID 59 with the tag or inbound dial peer of 105 to the application Managed App Process Toll Fraud App. And then we have the call disconnect. So what this is saying is that we don't trust the person who was talking to us from the inbound dial peer of 105. So let's clear off the screen. And so this gets us into, I'm going to do a show run pipe 2 section voice service VoIP because this is where we find this. We see that there's nothing under voice service VoIP. I did an S for section rather than an I for include. So this gets us into the new application by default called toll fraud. So I'm going to jump into voice service VoIP. And from here, I see IP. I want to jump into IP address trusted or toll fraud prevention. So when I hit enter, this drops me, whoops, sorry. And then I can say authenticate. And if I do show run pipe 2 section voice service VoIP, I see nothing there. That's because this is the default. There's a few different ways that we can deal with the toll fraud application. First of all, we can send it back to pre 15.1 2T days by simply saying, instead of IP address trusted authenticate, no IP address. And this disables the IP authentication on incoming H323 or SIP trunk calls. Do I want to confirm? Yes. Now when I show run, I see that non-default configuration. This will let the call through. We hear it ringing. And if we scroll back to our debug, let me scroll up to the top of this debug where we had just turned off the no IP address trust authenticate. Here's the beginning of my debug. Here's the destination. If we scroll down, here we go. This is where previously it was handing it to Managed App Process Toll Default, or sorry, Toll Fraud, and now it's handing it to default. And instead of call disconnect, the CC call is proceeding. So that's one way to take it back to pre-15.1 days. I don't like that because I think the toll fraud, this is going to enable it. I think the toll fraud bit is a great service. So instead, I'm going to do IP address trusted, and I'm going to say list. Now we can do call block and list specific causes, why, basically say why we're rejecting the call. But here I'm going to say list and hit enter. And now notice that instead of voice service VoIP, I'm jumped or dropped into the sub configuration of IP trust list. And here I can pretty much only do IPv4 currently. I can say things like, whoops, 0.0.0.0, 0000 for the mask as well, which is pretty much the same thing as no authentication. Okay, so here's the trusted list. Everybody. Does that work? Yep, that sounds like it works. And I'm just going to clear off the screen here. And I'm going to say do undebug all. And then do debug ISDN Q931, just to turn that back on. So let's take this out. I meant to show the configuration again. Okay, so let's turn on IPv4 for the IP address of 177.1.10. Let's say 20. Now, 20 was a subscriber on my previous 7.5 clusters, but here in the 8.5 versions of CUCM, it's nothing. It's not an IP address at all. And it's certainly not the only IP address or two IP addresses that should be talking to us. Our pub and sub from cluster 2, which are 177.1.10.15 and 16 respectively. So here I can say /32. And if I look at that configuration, it changed /32 to all 255s or all subnet mask bits to 1. So does this work? Nope, I get reorder tone. So let's take that configuration out. And let's put in the proper IP address, which is .15/32 and 16/32. So let's just take a look at the configuration here. Here I've got my two CUCM pub and sub hosts. And I could, of course, just put a subnet in, 177.1.10.0, and I could either put in /24 or 255.255.255.0 would be the same thing. This should work. Indeed, here goes the call out. And everything works fine. Just remember, especially if you're dealing with Cube, which absolutely needs this setup, that you have any and all IP4 IP address, either subnets or hosts, input that you will ever need to do signaling with. Okay, this is not for media, this is for signaling. Okay, otherwise, if this was for media and the media would go directly between the phone and the gateway, then when I tried to set up the call, and I guess we could just do this real quick. Let's go ahead and try to set up the call. And I'm going to go ahead and hit mute. And I'll answer it and test. Let's turn these volumes down quite a bit. Go off mute. Test. So maybe you heard the feedback. I went ahead and disconnected the call from the PSTN. But we did have media, so it has nothing to do with media. This is just for the signaling. Okay, so make sure you have all those input, and that is the new toll fraud feature or IP address trusted list feature. Now there is one other thing quickly that I forgot to mention, and that is that, let's get this back up here, voice service VoIP, is that we don't actually have to explicitly trust any IP address or host on any subnet if we happen to have a dial peer with that particular IP address specified as a session target. So let's take a look here at show run pipe 2 section voice 105, which is my only dial peer to and from the CUCM cluster 2. Now, typically I would have a second dial peer, one for the pub and one for the sub, or I should say one dial peer for every CPE or call processing engine. However, I just set up cluster 2 rather quickly, and I only set up session target to 177.1.10.15, which is the publisher. Now, that's not a problem. It is running the call manager service, so it is a CPE. And although all the phones and the gateway or trunk, let's see, go over here to the phones. And even though the phones are registered to the subscriber, which is .16, the publisher is alive. And so even the, actually it's a H323 gateway for this PSTN. And so it doesn't have a registration because H323 gateways don't register, but the device pool CL2 or cluster 2 branch 1, if we drop down over here, specifies the CCM group or unified CM group of sub 1-pub, and there the sub 1 is specified first. So although calls coming from the router, leaving from the router going to CUCM are going to the publisher, and then ICCS or intercluster communication signaling is sending the call over to the subscriber to be routed to the phones, that's all fine and well for calls from the PSTN, from the router, or from the H323 gateway to CUCM. But calls that are started from a phone and actually go out to the H323 gateway go from CUCM sub first. So that's why the call was failing and why we had to really put this IP address in. So I could take these out. Let's just go ahead and jump in here real quick. So let's go back to do show run, pipe 2 section voice service VoIP. I've got my IP address trusted list, but there's nothing configured there. And so again, calls going to the router should fail. Okay, there we go. Oh, that was the, what you just heard was I was hitting the up arrow so that you could, the up volume arrow so you could hear it. And one of the control HTTP posts from this verify client reached the phone after I had already hung up. So that's what it was doing. But dial still fails. Okay, but here's the thing. If I were just to add another dial peer, so let's take this, grab text edit, paste it in, change it to dial peer 106, same destination pattern, but session target 16. Don't need incoming called number. I don't have to have 2 incoming calls. Even if that's where the call's coming in from is 16, I don't have to have incoming called number on that particular dial peer. I just have to have a dial peer that points, because session target is not used for inbound calls. So incoming called number from CUCM is using this dial peer as an incoming dial peer or an ingress dial peer. And that is not what this session target is used for. It's used for outbound only. So I don't need that. I just simply have to have a session target pointing to the IP address that I want to trust. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And let's just take a look at everything. Service VoIP. We have no IP addresses in there. Let's take a look at dial peer 105. There we've got the publisher and the incoming called number. We do have to have 1 incoming called number. And dial peer 106, where we have no incoming called number, but we do have the subscriber. And so now, will this call work? Sure, no problem. So that is one exception, is that if we have a dial peer with the session target specified as an outbound, we inherently trust that IP address or that host.